I'm going to be sort of speaking about two different things in my talk today. The first is about the mystical experiences with psychedelics, which are similar to mystical experiences in other ways, and how that impacts social change. So it's like the political implications of the non-dual experience. And, and then I'm going to be talking about the therapeutic outcomes. And in that context, I'm going to talk about what we're trying to do to work through the FDA in order to bring psychedelic psychotherapy back into medical practice, so it's not so much the psychology of the future, but it's the psychology of hopefully the present. And it's still a little bit in the future. We're predicting 2021 for MDMA becoming a prescription medicine. But those are the what I'll talk to you about today. And I want to start by really talking about how many of us perceive the current world situation. A lot of it is in a crisis, and Albert Einstein has said it has become appallingly obvious that our technology has exceeded our humanity. And I think that's really clear, that we have so much incredible scientific knowledge, but we don't have the spiritual and emotional maturity to handle it. And as a consequence, the environment's being destroyed. There's the potential of nuclear destruction. So how do we really handle the products of the mind that we have developed that are incredibly powerful? And there's some hints in the UNESCO Charter. It says, since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. So what they're saying essentially is that it's psychological factors that are really what threaten the survival of the human race, the survival of the life on Earth, and that we have to find some way psychologically to bring about a healthier state. And Albert Einstein, again, has said the splitting of the atom has changed everything save our mode of thinking, and thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. We shall require a substantially new manner of thinking if mankind is to survive. Now, what is this new manner of thinking that he's talking about? And I think it is precisely the non-dual thinking. It's that recognition that underneath all of the different ways that we define ourselves in terms of our country, our religion, our race, our gender, our socioeconomic status, all the different ways that we draw our identity that also makes us and them distinctions. That if we can understand underneath all of that, that we're all together, that it's all one, then that will breed more tolerance, more understanding, and that's the new mode of thinking. And that's what we see is happening all over the world, this emphasis on globalization, but it's also coming into conflict with a lot of fundamentalism. And so how do we promote this new manner of thinking? And in the early 1980s, I was inspired by a book by Robert Mueller. And Robert Mueller was the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, kind of the mystic of the United Nations. And this book was New Genesis, Shaping a Global Spirituality. And you could see also the profound shift in consciousness that took place once we had images of the Earth from the moon, once people could really understand that the planet was, a single system. And this book was really basically that thesis, is that we need this mystical experience that is anchored not in just a few people, but in millions and billions of people, and then we'll have a more peaceful world. And his book was inspiring, but he didn't say anything about psychedelics. And so I decided that I would write him a letter. And I was just a college undergraduate at the time, and I said, I'm really profoundly influenced by your book, but there is a lot of people who have found this kind of spirituality through psychedelics, and right now that research is suppressed all over the world as part of the counter-reaction against the 60s. I said, would you help to bring back psychedelic research from your position at the UN? And I told him a lot about the Good Friday experiment, which I'll tell you about in just a few minutes. And to my utter surprise, he wrote me back. a handwritten note. And he said he would help, and that he did agree that it was important for science to use psychedelics to understand mystical experiences, and that from whatever he could do, he would help out. And through incredible coincidences, in 1984 and 85, MDMA was starting to be criminalized, and we were doing pretty well shutting them down and slowing DEA down in the United States, and they moved internationally through the WHO. And Stan's brother, Paul, was actually in charge of this committee that was reviewing the scientific evidence to make recommendations about whether MDMA and other molecules should be criminalized. And Robert Mueller arranged for me to go speak to the scientific advisor of that committee. And in a tremendous lone sort of heroism, Paul was the only one of that committee that voted against the criminalization of MDMA. And there was just a tiny little footnote in their report to the WHO about recommending the criminalization, and it said that Paul was worried that the criminalization would slow down the research, and that he got the committee to encourage the nations of the world to facilitate research into this most interesting substance. So what on the larger scale looked like a major defeat, that MDMA was recommended for criminalization all over the world, this little footnote eventually was used by the Swiss government in 1988 to resume research with psychedelics. And so sort of the lone critic standing up against the tide of history can make a difference, and Paul was a great example of that, as is Stan. So the Good Friday experiment, this is really what I was speaking about with Robert Mueller. This was one of the best things that Timothy Leary ever did. He was the faculty sponsor for Walter Pahnke. This was an experiment that was done in 1962 on Good Friday, and it was the first scientifically rigorous study looking at whether psychedelics, in this case psilocybin, administered to religiously inclined people in a religious setting could facilitate a mystical experience. And according to the scholars, Walter Houston Clark, at the time, he said, "There are no experiments known to me in the history of the scientific study of religion better designed or clearer in their conclusions than this one." Now, the study actually took place at Marsh Chapel in Boston University, and it took place downstairs in the Robinson Chapel. The sermon from the main chapel was sort of piped in downstairs, and there was 20 subjects from Andover Newton Theological Seminary and 10 helpers that were Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, Ralph Metzner, Houston Smith, an incredible group of people that were assisting. Half the helpers and half the divinity students got psilocybin, and the other half got a placebo. To give you a sense as to how non-controversial, in a sense, this was, in 1962, the minister was Reverend Howard Thurman. And Howard Thurman was the chaplain of Marsh Chapel, but he was also Martin Luther King's mentor. He was absolutely incredible preacher, very beautiful, evocative preacher, and he led the service. He permitted this research to take place in this basement chapel. And the actual sermon and service still exists. We have tape recordings of the Good Friday experiment from that day that I got from Eva Pahnke, Walter's widow. Now, in order to do this experiment, the question was, what is a mystical experience? And we heard from Robert Thurman about all the different layers, but this was an attempt by Walter to develop a typology of mysticism that spanned different religions, cross-cultural, and defined it without any particular references to specific religious figures in any particular religion. So even though this was on Good Friday in a Christian church, there was no mention of identification with Christ. So this is kind of an abstract definition of what a mystical experience was. And this same questionnaire, slightly modified, is now being used in the research with MDMA, with psilocybin, with LSD, to try to quantify the depth of the mystical experience. And so to give you a sense of what it was, there's 6 criteria. The first one is this sense of unity, and it can be either internal or external, the formless or connected with everything that is. And this is the primary way to evaluate the mystical experience. There's also the transcendence of time and space, the sense of eternity. There's a sense of sacredness, and I use this picture from the Western Wall and the Dome of the Mosque, Dome of the Rock there. Somehow this feeling of there's something sacred about it. There's also a sense of objective reality, that something about this is true, sometimes more true than what we see with our senses. There's a deeply felt positive mood, and a sense that it's ineffable. This is an M.C. Escher thing, that you can't really describe it in words. And in the 80s, after I had written to Robert Mueller about this Good Friday experiment, I had to do a thesis at the college that I went to. Everybody had to do a senior thesis, and I wanted to do psychedelic research, but it was suppressed at that time. And I realized that sometimes long-term follow-ups are crucial in terms of understanding the importance and the lasting impact of studies that have been done long before, and that with long-term follow-ups, you're not actually giving drugs, you're just giving questionnaires. And Walter Pahnke had died in a scuba diving accident in 1971, and so I'm sure that if he was alive, he would have done this long-term follow-up, because in terms of the mystical experience, the key element is called the fruits test. So it's not so much how you describe it, although it is how you describe what happens, but what are the consequences of the mystical experience? What are the fruits of the tree? And if you can understand that, then that adds another layer of validity to the initial experiment. So I decided that I would do a long-term 25-year follow-up to this study. This I published in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology. And what I was able to do was to identify 19 out of the 20 of the original participants. There was no list of their names. I went to Timothy Leary and others and said, do you have a list of their names? There was no list. I went to Andover Newton and asked if they had a list. They didn't have a list. I went to their library, and they didn't even have Walter Pahnke's thesis. One of the most important studies ever done. It was like cultural amnesia at the time. And I said, okay, could I put a notice in your newsletter to alumni and say, if anybody was in the study, would you have them contact me? And they said, absolutely not. We will not do that. We don't want to know anything about this. So I went back to the library, and I stumbled on a list of their alumni. As of 1973, it was kind of out of date, but I just figured, okay, I'm going to write to every single person. And eventually that led me to 3 or 4 people, and then that led me, and I got to 19 of them. And I traveled all over the country, and I interviewed them. And part of the reason for me was this theory that I've described to you, in a sense, the political implications of the non-dual experience. I wanted to double-check that. And so what I did was I, first off, administered the same questionnaire to the people that were in the original study. And the important point here, if you can look at this bottom number. Now, this is the average. The way it was set up is if you had 60% of the possible score, that was considered a full mystical experience. And these were the experimental groups, 60.8, and this was the control group. And the study showed that those people that did have the psilocybin had this mystical experience much more. 9 out of the 20 had a mystical experience. 8 out of those 9 were from the psilocybin group. But after 25 years, filling out the same questionnaire in retrospect, it was very similar, a little bit better even, and didn't hardly change in the placebo group. So at the time of the Reagan escalation of the war on drugs, at the time of Just Say No, when people would have the most cultural pressure to reject their prior mystical experience, these people affirmed it. And that incredible. Also, what I found is that people were able to remember the experiment. A lot of the people in the control group didn't have many vivid memories. A few did, but most didn't. And everybody who had the psilocybin could tell me very vivid details about portions of their experience. So something, first off, about memory, about the way these experiences are deeply and profoundly imprinted on memory, was clear. But also they talked about the implications of the sense of spirituality to their personal spiritual life and their political life. And so what these people said was that it helped them resolve career decisions, recognize the arbitrariness of ego boundaries, increase their depth of faith, increase their appreciation of eternal life, not in the sense of necessarily reincarnation, but just that they were part of this timeless process. It deepened their sense of the meaning of Christ, and it heightened their sense of joy and beauty. These are the kind of things that are the fruits of the mystical experience for them, as they reported. But from my point of view, from a political point of view, and just to mention, I wanted to become a psychedelic psychotherapist. I wrote Stan a letter in 1972. I read The Realms of the Human Unconscious in a manuscript copy when I was just an 18-year-old, given to me by the guidance counselor at my college, where I went because I was having troubles integrating my LSD experiences. And I was so fortunate to read Stan's book, and that clarified everything for me, because there was science looking at spirituality, looking at values, and looking at therapeutic outcomes. So it was the reality check. Can we actually use all of this information to help people? And I thought this would be my road forward. I would dedicate myself to bringing psychedelics back, and that was the decision I made at 18 in 1972, because I sort of believed in some of the ideology of the 60s. I saw the Beatles doing LSD and talking about love, not war. I think there's something about the crackdown that happened was actually when psychedelics go right, not when psychedelics go wrong. So here's what they said. They said that the mystical experience produced an increase of tolerance for other religions. It deepened equanimity in the face of difficult life crises. It promoted greater solidarity and identification with foreign peoples, minorities, women, these were all men, and nature, and it reduced their fear of death. So this was really confirmation for me of the importance politically of bringing back psychedelics, not just psychotherapeutically, but politically to build a better world. And is this possible in our Western culture? Well, if we look back in history, the longest-running mystery ceremony that we know of, the Eleusinian Mysteries, ran for 2,000 years and in Greece, and was wiped out in 396 by the Catholic Church, who wanted to have a monopoly on access to God. And Albert Hoffman and Carl Ruck and Gordon Wasson did some studies and wrote about how there was a potion, Kykeon, that was drank during these Eleusinian Mysteries that had an ergot derivative in it that was similar to LSD. So we're not so much trying to establish for the first time in Western culture the enshrinement of non-ordinary states of consciousness and spiritual ceremonies like this, but it's going back to the origins in a way. We've kind of lost our way. So how do we get there? And this is an important chart here, and it really shows to me that legalization follows medicalization. So this is a chart about public attitudes towards the legalization of marijuana over the last 40 years. This is the Gallup poll. So what you see here in 1970, only 12% were in favor of legalizing marijuana. There was a rise during the 70s, and this is a corresponding decline in those people that are against it. There was this rise during the 70s, and then there was the backlash, the parents' movements. There was a certain, I think, arrogance in the psychedelic community also. One dose, miracle cure, we're all enlightened, we know more than everybody else, we're the counterculture. That kind of identification results in, or almost invites crackdown. But then what we see here is that things go flat once this backlash comes about for about 20 years. Starting here around 1996, the public attitudes towards the legalization of marijuana start to climb. And a few years ago, they crossed the 50% mark. So what really happened when we start thinking about it? When that crackdown happened, what really started bringing things back? And 1996 is when California and Arizona passed the medical marijuana laws. And then more and more states started doing that. So the medicalization of marijuana has changed attitudes towards the legalization of marijuana. And we know this also from exit polls. The people who are running the initiatives on medical marijuana and now marijuana legalization are getting pretty sophisticated. And they've got resources, they've got pollers. And so exit polls have shown that the single most important factor in terms of whether somebody is in favor of the legalization of marijuana is not if they smoke marijuana themselves. You would think that people who smoke pot don't want to be criminals. But there's a more important factor even, which is if you know a medical marijuana patient, you have a direct knowledge about the benefits, and it overcomes a lot of this propaganda. So legalization follows medicalization. So how then do we bring back psychedelics, bring back these experiences above ground? And for me, it's through medicalization. And so in 1986, I started MAPS as basically a nonprofit pharmaceutical company focused on psychedelics and marijuana. And for a bunch of different reasons, I felt that MDMA is the most gentle of the psychedelics. We believe that psychotherapists are more effective if they give MDMA to patients if they've done it themselves. I mean, you don't go to a yoga teacher who doesn't do yoga. You don't study meditation from somebody that doesn't meditate. So I think the fields of psychiatry and psychotherapy, there's more resistance to them doing LSD or doing psilocybin than there is to doing MDMA. So I think also MDMA is easy to integrate the experience. It's more open-hearted. So I felt that from a strategic point of view, MDMA is the drug that we wanted to focus on to try to bring back through the FDA system. And this started in 1984. You can kind of see me back there. This is me spying on the DEA. They're always looking at us, and I figured, all right, so this is actually right before I walked in the door and submitted a petition to request a hearing. They had moved to criminalize MDMA, which they knew only as ecstasy. The underground therapy movement knew of it as Adam. And there was about 500,000 doses used in the therapeutic personal growth context. None of that really came to the attention of the DEA, but some of those people who were involved in that said, aha, this is something that should be wider used, and they decided to call it ecstasy and do mass marketing of it. And that's what attracted the attention of the DEA. But prior to this, we knew this crackdown was coming, and so we were sort of introducing MDMA to various people. And I want to just highlight two of them and also indicate to you that there's spiritual aspects, mystical aspects to MDMA. This is Brother David Steindl-Rast, Roman Catholic monk who was at a monastery right near Esalen. And so he came actually in 1982 to a workshop that I took with Stan and Christina on the mystical quest. And he took an interest in this, and since it was legal at the time, he was willing to take a gift of MDMA and also he was referred to me by Robert Mueller, and so he took MDMA in the monastery in a half dose for meditation. And he said a monk spends his whole life cultivating the same awakened attitude MDMA gives you. And this was in Newsweek in 1985. This was sort of the first media that was coming out about MDMA. And so we completely destroyed the stereotype of the hedonistic, party-using young person recklessly taking drugs. Instead, we had Brother David talking about MDMA. And then Zalman Schachter Shalomi, an Orthodox rabbi who had actually done LSD earlier with Tim Leary, he said, you call the Sabbath a delight. MDMA is like the Sabbath at the end of a long week. And this was in the Washington Post. And so I was involved in now this DEA lawsuit. And as the spokesperson, I was saying, I think that it should be a medical tool, Schedule 3, available to psychiatrists and psychotherapists, but I don't think that it should be illegal. I think that the non-medical use is legitimate and people can grow. And so that was a delicate kind of position to take, and that got me labeled as, this is a cover of the Miami newspaper. I lived in Florida, and it says, the selling of ecstasy how a Sarasota college student became the Timothy Leary of the 1980s. So this was not my most successful, media relations. On the other hand, this is Tim Leary, and this was actually at a conference for MAPS, and I was asking him for his advice on, how to deal with the government. And he said, "Fuck the government." He said, "I am so far beyond asking for permission." He said, "But I'm really glad you're trying to do it." So, so what we're doing now is nonprofit drug development. This is our drug development plan. Our first study in the U.S. started in 2004. I don't want you to look at the details, but just the point is that we've hired a woman, Amy Emerson, from Novartis, and so she's guiding our clinical development. We have an incredible team of people who are helping us do this clinical research, and we've actually are able to work we have a consultant as a former senior FDA official from the Division of Psychiatry Products who's advising us as well. So this is our drug development plan. The goal is to get MDMA approved by 2021. GMP means medical grade, good manufacturing practices. And then we're going to be training therapists and ultimately setting up a network of psychedelic clinics. The model here is the hospice center that 2004, there was 3,500 of these in every town, but the first one was 30 years before in 1974. So it will take several decades, I think, to roll out psychedelic clinics. So the psychiatry of the future will start in a few years, but it will really permeate, I think, over the next couple decades. What permits us to do this is what I call the Aikido Strategy of drug development. And it's because MDMA is demonized, because LSD is demonized, because psilocybin and marijuana have all been demonized Schedule I drugs, governments of the world have spent an enormous amount of money trying to show their risks. And this stuff is in the public domain. So if you go to Medline and you put in ecstasy or MDMA, you get over 5,000 papers. We estimate at a cost of over $300 million. The risks are very well characterized. We understand mechanism of action pretty well, and over 1,100 people, only a few more than 100 are from our studies, but over 1,100 people have received MDMA in clinical research, funded usually by the government. So we're building on this, and the first thing we need to do to make MDMA into a medicine is develop a medical-grade MDMA. So we've just signed a contract with a firm in the United Kingdom, Chassun, to make 1 kilogram medical-grade MDMA. I had a kilogram made by Dave Nichols in 1985 for $4,000. It's great, it's super pure, but it's not properly documented to be used for phase 3 and prescription use. This current kilogram, same amount, is going to cost about $400,000. But if we start actually succeeding, they've got the capability to scale up. We've done studies, multiple countries of the world. Part of this, again, is a political strategy. In case there's a backlash, we're able to work in other countries. But now it doesn't look like there will be a backlash, although we're very careful to scan the horizon constantly for that. This is our treatment model. What we basically do is the 3.5-month treatment process. And we think of it as MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. It's really psychotherapy punctuated by 3 sessions of MDMA. Our initial studies are really just, this is the screening measures. We've got these weekly non-drug psychotherapy. These triangles are the MDMA sessions, then more integrative work, then another MDMA session. And at this point, we break the blind after the second, like 2 months after the second session. And then the people that had the full dose get a 3rd session and then 2 months and 1 year follow-up. And the people that were in the placebo group, we let them go through the study again, what's called open label, so that they can then, they're their own controls. So it's scientifically valuable, and it also helps with recruitment and retention, because everybody's going to get the full dose MDMA. So that's the first session, second session, there's the outcomes, then the 3rd session, and then it goes back again, those people that were there, and then the 2-month and 1 year follow-up. This is where the treatments take place in Charleston, South Carolina, similarly outfitted treatment centers in other places. And our therapeutic approach is based on a non-directive approach that we've learned from Stan, and others, but it's this idea that there is, Stan talked about the radar, the inner radar of things coming up of what you need to deal with. And so we have a non-directive approach with the inner healer, the inner wisdom, and whatever it happens to be, and we'll work with that. And we've developed a treatment manual, and we have adherence raters that are able to watch the videotapes of all the therapy sessions and give feedback to the therapists about how well they're complying to the manual. And not to say that ours is the only way or the best way, it's just the way that we think optimizes outcomes. Now, in terms of outcomes, we're going to have about 105 people, and we are now near the end of a 15-year process, starting in 2000, of treating all these people for PTSD, and we're gathering the data to submit to the FDA. And the first thing they want to know is safety. So the concerns about MDMA have been about neurotoxicity, about brain changes, but the functional consequences have been focused mostly on supposed neurocognitive consequences of heavy ecstasy users. So we've done a series of neurocognitive studies before and after subjects have been in our study. This again is the placebo people. These are this is the low dose. This is around 100 milligrams. This is around 125 milligrams. You can see that the red is after MDMA. So there's no evidence whatsoever of this. This was the completely doctored brain scan shown by Oprah, also on MTV, of a woman who supposedly abused MDMA and has holes in her brain. What they did here was, this is a SPECT scan, blood flow through the brain, and they just took an arbitrary level of any area that had blood flow below a certain area, and they just turned it into a hole. So completely fraudulent, but very scary. We've also done studies with body temperature. Sometimes people overheat and die at raves, young people who end up getting hyperthermia. So we've shown very little effect on temperature. These are at different doses. Very minimal, 1 degree about rise, temporary. So there's no real problems with temperature when taken in a clinical setting. This is about blood pressure. There's really no significant concerns here about blood pressure either. We do permit people who have controlled hypertension, but if people have uncontrolled hypertension, we won't work with them, at least initially. So this is also reassuring to the FDA. And then these are some of the side effects: anxiety, jaw clenching, appetite. These are ones that are just where the low doses, actually have higher fatigue, muscle tension. So you can see that people who are suffering from PTSD, even when they don't get much MDMA, they have some side effects, but there's nothing alarming here, so that's also reassuring. So we think that we can address the safety concerns. But this is really the key thing I want to show you today in terms of our outcomes. What's going on here is effect size. We all know about statistical, or most of us know about statistical significance, but you can have large numbers of people in a study and have statistical significance, but have a finding that's not clinically significant. Small findings, large number of subjects, statistically significant. So a new measure has been developed called effect size. And effect size, it's about 0.3 is small, 0.5 is medium, 0.8 is large. The drugs that FDA has approved for PTSD have about a 0.3 effect size. We have large effect sizes. This is what this column is showing you. So we are able to take people who have failed on other medications, treatment resistant, and we're able to really help them. Most of them end up a lot better off. And so this is also encouraging, and we think that this will be something that the FDA will take into account as we apply in February or March or so. We're going to summarize all of our data and submit an end of phase 2 meeting and ask to debate the design of phase 3 with FDA. And we hope to have that concluded by early 2017. Now, the psilocybin research is also going on now. Psilocybin for end of life, psilocybin for alcoholism. And the early work that Stan has done with LSD, with alcoholics, with end of life, with people that had cancer, were scared of dying, the key finding from there is that the mystical experience is linked to therapeutic outcomes. The more deeply somebody can have this unitive experience, the more they're able to overcome alcoholism and fear of death. And that's how these studies and the therapy with the classic psychedelics are kind of meant to encourage people to have this mystical experience. But that is not, but MDMA does also have mystical potential. And so the same questionnaire, this is to show you that the comparator doses, the low doses, really people didn't, this is 30, 40 milligrams, 25 milligrams, people didn't really have a mystical experience here. But when we do these active doses, it's 0.46, and this is the mean. Quite a few people had above this point, and so experiences with MDMA can have this mystical aspect to it. However, what this shows is that there is no correlation between the mystical experience and therapeutic outcomes in terms of reducing PTSD symptoms. This is for the comparator doses, and then this is more for the full doses. And you can see all these people that are above 0.6, 9 out of around 33 had a full mystical experience with MDMA. But that reinforces our idea of this inner healer, that we have a non-directive approach, whether it's a spiritual experience, a biographical experience, re-experiencing birth, or any kind of transpersonal experience. We'll follow and encourage people, whatever it is, where they go. This is the first study that we did. This was mostly women survivors of childhood sexual abuse. This was the baseline. This was after the MDMA, and then this is the long-term follow-up, which is 3.5 years later on average. And so 83% of the people in this study were cured of PTSD after having had it an average of 19 years. Now, not everybody stays cured. We went to the FDA and said there's a few people that have relapsed. We'd like to give them another MDMA session. We got permission to do that. And then what you can see is that they all went down below. This is the cutoff for moderate to severe PTSD. But one of them got better, one of them got slightly worse, and one of them got worse. This was a woman who was homeless, living in her car. So you need social supports. But the idea we're trying to say is it's not a miracle cure. Not everybody's going to be cured forever. Life keeps coming. But that maybe we can give additional MDMA sessions a year later, 2 years later, whenever, as a kind of a refresher. And this suggests that will work. This got reported in the Washington Post as the peace drug. So part of this, again, is that public opinion is really important. That's what really drove the drug war and drove the suppression of this research, the fear inculcated in the public. And so we need to do a lot of public education. So this was terrific. We had one vet in this initial study, and we got it called the peace drug. This was Oprah. Oprah was now atoning for her holes in the brain image. This was the O Magazine article in 2011, where she permitted her one of her senior editors to do a story on MDMA and actually take MDMA in an underground illegal therapeutic setting and report on it, how positive it was for her in O Magazine. So this is propaganda in the other way. This is one magic pill that cures all your problems, but we'll take it. And this is our Swiss study. You can see again that we've got significant decline. Well, this was only 12 subjects. It was 0.06, almost significant, but the effect sizes were similar, and then on follow-up, it continues to get better. This was the crucial study that we're doing right now. So the issue is this going to work with war-related trauma? Is this going to work with men? The drugs that have been used before for Zoloft and Paxil have been approved by the FDA for PTSD. They tend to work more in women than in men. And in some cases, they don't work in the studies in men at all. So we wanted to do war-related PTSD. And for political reasons, I said, all right, well, let's just say the study is not just for veterans, it's for firefighters and police officers. I didn't think we'd get any, but the idea was just to say, this is for first responders, this is for the mainstream. And in the end, we did get 3 firefighters, including one who was at 9/11 in New York, and we actually got a police officer who volunteered for this study. So I think this idea of the healing potential, whether it comes from psychedelics or not, when people are suffering enough, they're willing to reach out. So what we've shown here is tremendous results. But the big surprise here, and I liked when Robert Thurman talked about how theories are great, but experience is more important. So I spent, so I got a PhD from Harvard, from the Kennedy School of Government, on the regulation of the medical use of psychedelics. And a big part of my dissertation was about how to deal with the double-blind problem. And it was about doing dose-response studies. It was a beautiful theory. In practice, it turned out to be totally wrong. And which I'm grateful for, because now we know more. But I was a little bit sad. My theory was wrong. But what we found is that the medium dose, this is the medium dose, the 75 milligrams, did the best, more than the 125 milligrams, and this was the 40 milligrams. There's actually kind of an anti-therapy. Even though they got a little bit better, people got better just from our therapy. The therapy was effective, and they got greater declines in the first study than they did with the 40 milligrams. And so this 75 milligram group doing so well, what it's telling us is that there's something about the memory reconsolidation processes that is helping people to recategorize traumatic memories. When you're feeling safe, that MDMA gives you this sense of safety and self-acceptance. And then when you review a traumatic experience, then you consolidate the memory. It used to be thought that memory was like you take a book off the shelf, you read it, and you stick it back. But it's actually, you take this book from different parts of your brain, and then you remember it, and then you have to reconsolidate the memory. And that explains in some ways how our memories shift over time. And if you're feeling safe when you're looking at a traumatic memory, what happens is that you actually remember more of the trauma because it's not so emotionally loaded. And when you reconsolidate the memory, you can recall the incident without the fear because you reconsolidate it when you were feeling peaceful. So that's what I think this is telling us with the remarkable results at the 75 milligram. And so we are now trying to submit all of this to FDA. Just to show you, this here is, we study depression as well. Depression is comorbid with PTSD. It also goes down very well. And then this is part of the public relations. When it comes to the health and well-being of those who serve, we should leave our politics at the door and not be afraid to follow the data. There's now an evidence base for this MDMA therapy and a plausible story about what may be going on in the brain to account for the effects. This was Brigadier General Lori Sutton, the highest-ranking psychiatrist in the military. She called me out of the blue from a military plane while she was flying. She got a phone call to me and said, "What's going on with this MDMA stuff?" And she was very helpful. And now, I was a draft resistor in Vietnam, anticipating going to jail. And so you can imagine how healing it was when I ended up at the Pentagon. And this is Michael Mithoefer, our lead. You weren't supposed to take pictures there, so I had to go really quickly. That's Michael Mithoefer there, and this is Richard Rockefeller. His father is David Rockefeller. He was the chairman of the board of advisors of Doctors Without Borders, and he was very sympathetic with whole populations being traumatized, millions of people, refugees, what do you do? And there's not enough therapists to help them, and he started interested in MDMA. And so he contacted me about 6 years ago, and he said, "How can I help?" And I said, "The toughest thing we're trying to do is deal with the military. They have a tremendous problem. Last year, they spent $6 billion on PTSD disability payments to around 300,000 vets, and they have an enormous problem. And but they were resisting because of the drug war. And so Richard and his cousin, Senator Jay Rockefeller, who was on the Veterans Affairs Committee, had discussions with us and arranged for us to go into the Pentagon. And so now we're doing informal collaborations with the military. We just got a $2 million grant from the state of Colorado to do a study with marijuana for veterans with PTSD. Marijuana is more about controlling symptoms than it is about a cure, but it's still effective for controlling symptoms, and this will be the first study ever. So I really wanted to sort of dedicate this part of the talk and end my talk by just saying how much I honor and respect Richard. He died in a plane crash about 1.5 years ago, and the night before he died, he was with his father's 98th birthday, and he said to his family that he felt like he had helped us, his work was complete with helping us with the relationship with the military. And I think that is true. I mean, there's a lot more still to be done, but we now are on a trajectory to really integrate psychedelic medicine back into our psychiatry and psychology, and then hopefully move beyond that to broader legalization, and then for those that want to have this non-dual experience, hopefully we will be in a position where that can be done in a legal context. So thank you very much.